Chapter 4 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 4. The Waiho River, Franz Josef Glacier. Journey southwards. Waiho River, Lake Maporika. Terminal face. Camp 1. Attempts on Glacier. Hot Springs. Camp 2. Camp 3. Icefall. Baffled. Return. On the 6th October 1893, Mr. C.E. Douglas and I left Hokitika with instructions to map Lake Ianthe, some 40 miles south along the road, and thence traverse the Wanganui River to the sea from the ferry on the road, after which we had to make our way further south to the Waiho River and explore the Franz Josef Glacier. A daily coach runs to Ross, a small mining township of 500 inhabitants, 20 miles from Hokitika, and thence there is a weekly pack-horse mail service to Gillespie's Beach, 88 miles south of Ross and near the mouth of Cook River. We therefore put our small supply of clothing on the coach as far as Ross, and here obtained 3 weeks' stores and a pack-horse to carry them to Lake Ianthe. It took us to the 20th to finish our work on the lake, and on the 22nd we started in a small dugout, or canoe, hollowed out of a tree down the outlet which flowed into the Wanganui River, and on the 24th went down the river to the sea, having some very narrow escapes in the foaming rapids. Our craft was only 6 feet by 2 feet, and very clumsily made, so we had a good deal to be thankful for in getting down safely. It was largely due to luck, helped by Douglas's steering. Next day we returned on foot to our camp, some 7 miles up the river, and thence carried our impedimenta 5 miles on to Hendy's Ferry, which is on the main south track, 30 miles south of Ross. This road, after leaving Ross, skirts along the foot of the hills, and crosses the Wanganui at Hendy's Ferry, 30 miles, the Wataroa River at Gunn's Ferry, 50 miles, branches off to Lake Maporika on the left hand, and Okarito, 64 miles from Ross, on the right hand side. From the latter place, which lies on the sea beach, the road is non-existent, and it is just possible to take a wheeled vehicle to that point, the journey occupying about 3 days from Hokitika. From Hendy's Ferry, where we slept, we carried our loads and tramped to Gunn's on the Wataroa, and on the 20th of October went on to the Miners' Rest at the Forks, a settlement at the point where the road branches. The Forks is a township which can boast of a public house and 1 digger's hut, though in old days it had a large population when plenty of gold was being obtained there. Now, however, only 2 or 3 parties are working near it, and, on mail night especially, the whole neighbouring population, of perhaps 10, assemble at the Miners' Rest. I am sorry to say they do not confine themselves to tea. On these occasions politics form the chief topic of conversation, because numbers of diggers, having Hansard's parliamentary reports sent to them gratis, and religiously reading every word, are keen politicians. I cannot conceive anyone wading through these reports, for when it is remembered that there are some members in the House who speak for no other reason than to see themselves, or for their constituents to see them, in Hansard, it can be imagined what sort of reading they afford. One evening, when we were waiting for pack-horses to take our stores as far as possible up the Waiho River, I became involved in a political discussion. One of the diggers charged me with being a capitalist. "How can I be a capitalist when I've no money?" I answered. "Money," he explained, "has nothing to do with it." I remonstrated. He said, "Well, I don't know about your money, but you speak like a capitalist." I again objected that I could hardly be called a capitalist if I had no capital. So he changed his ground and said, "Well, you're a conservative anyway." Being of opinion that there were no conservatives in this colony, and objecting to the expression, I thought this a good opportunity to find out what politicians meant by it. So I replied, "Ah, yes, I may be a conservative, but you must tell me what a conservative is before I can answer." "A conservative," he said hesitatingly, is a man you don't agree with." I always suspected this to be the truth of the matter, for each party generally dubs itself the Great Liberal Party, which I suppose implies that the other side are conservatives. On the 31st we obtained 2 horses, and went on towards Franz Josef Glacier. About 3 miles from the forks is Maporika Township, which consists of a store and a public house, with a small population of 10 or 20 diggers. Here we procured our necessaries. A horse can be taken right up to the terminal face of the glacier, so there was no need to procure all our stores at once. We therefore only ordered enough for a month or 6 weeks, for we might perhaps finish our work in that time if favoured with fine weather, and if not, could easily have more sent up. After leaving the township, the road, or horse track, skirts the beautiful Maporika Lake, and many lovely views are to be seen through openings in the bush. To see this lake to advantage, it is necessary to stay a day or two at the township and hire a boat. I camped on a promontory halfway up the lake for a week in January 1894, when surveying it, at the time of the full moon, and the views day and night were glorious. At the southern end, the snowy peaks of the Bismarck Range tower into the sky, with Mounts Cook and Tasman just appearing over them. And at a distance of 9 miles, the Franz Josef Glacier is seen coming out of the valley, between bush-clad hills, and apparently pushing its way into the bush at the head of the lake. In the foreground are numerous promontories, with great trees overhanging and reflecting in the perfectly still water, or perhaps the limb of some fallen giant stands naked out of the placid surface of the lake. After my day's work, I used to get into my boat and drift about on the lake, smoking the pipe of contentment, and watching the last rays of the sun throwing a pink glow over the great snow peaks, and the gloom gradually deepening over the glacier and lower valleys. Then the moon would rise and shed its white light over the whole scene, and make me loth to return to my camp in the bush, with its mosquitoes. About 8 miles from Maporika Township, after leaving the lake, the track passes a farm on the river flats of the Totra and Waiho rivers, on which sheep and cattle are grazed, and which is one of the few farms in the south where more than a living can be made. This is chiefly owing to the fairly large number of diggers in the district. The homestead is only a small house, but it is surrounded by a few acres of cleared land laid down in grass, and forms a pleasing contrast to the sombre-coloured bush and hills behind. Crossing the Totra River, the track continues for 2 miles to the Waiho River, where some 4 or 5 parties are gold digging and have their huts. One of them, Mr. Jim Nisbet, having been there for over 20 years. His hut is on the north side of the river, just below where the left-hand branch, or Callery River, joins the Glacier branch, or Waiho. From Nisbet's hut, a small foot-track runs along the bank of the former river for half a mile to a wire suspension footbridge, which spans the stream some 50 feet above the water, at the mouth of a magnificent gorge. This is one of the finest gorges I know, within easy reach of tourists. The river is a large glacier-fed stream, and descends very rapidly through a deep and narrow rocky gorge, above which the mountains rise abruptly to the height of 3,000 or 4,000 feet. The contrast of dark green bush on the almost precipitous hillsides, with the grey rock walls of the gorge rising 100 feet sheer and overhanging out of the river, which comes boiling and roaring down over immense boulders, is very grand, while in the distance between the bush-clad hills can be seen the glaciers of Drummond's Peak, some miles up the Callery River. On the small level piece of ground between the 2 branches, and at the foot of a rounded hill, the Doughboy, there's a digger's hut called the Hospital, and a few chains further on the bank of the glacier, or right-hand branch, are some hot springs, of which more will be said. The county council bought this hut for the use of tourists and others who visited the hot springs, but as only 1 or 2 come in the year, Andrew Gordon and A. Woodham, working a claim close by, had taken possession. By the hot springs another footbridge spanned the glacier branch, but that was swept away in February 1894 by a flood. However, we used it constantly while there. The government are now building another across the Waiho, below the junction of the 2 rivers, from Nisbet's hut to the south bank, and have formed a fair horse track to the terminal face of the glacier. After crossing the second footbridge, we had only 1 1/2 miles to go to the spot chosen for our head camp, which we pitched on November 1st in some tall scrub within 400 yards of the glacier. To this point numerous persons had been in the past, but the glacier and the upper valley had not been touched, presumably because no one having any knowledge of icecraft had been there. Our camp has not yet been described, And, as it is the simplest and best form of shelter for a party of 2 working in rough country and near forest or scrub, an exact description of it may prove useful. It is an invention of Douglas's, and we call it a batwing. In the ordinary course of camp life, survey parties can have their loads packed on horseback, and carry tent and fly, with a second smaller fly to pitch at the end of the tent to shelter the fire. We, however, have to carry all our goods and chattels on our backs, and over very rough, unexplored country, so could not afford to take such a weighty camp. We therefore pitch an ordinary 6-foot by 8-foot canvas tent on a ridgepole with an 8-foot by 10-foot fly 6 inches above it, and cut the tent in half along the ridge, and taking away 1/2, leave the other standing. This is just large enough to allow 2 men to lie heads and tails. The front or side is left open, and one side of the fly, which was over the half taken away, is raised about 4 feet in the middle, and the 2 corners slightly less. Under this the fire burns about 3 feet away from the remaining half of the tent, so that in wet weather we have shelter for ourselves and fire, and save more than half the weight, and though rather cramped for room, are fairly comfortable. Should a heavy gale of wind make the shelter too cold, or cause discomfort by blowing the smoke into the batwing, we make a breakwind of ferns or branches across in front to protect us. We never have more than this to cover us, and often when necessary to travel in light order, trust to finding some friendly rock to sleep under, or build a mai with bark and ferns. Our stores arrived by pack horse next day from Maporika, a ford rather below Nesbitt's hut having been found for the horses. Having made ourselves fairly comfortable and ready for a long stay, I spent the afternoon in looking about the terminal face and reconnoitring to determine our best mode of attacking the very rough glacier in front of us. The exact position of the terminal face of the Franz Josef Glacier is lat. south 43 degrees 25 minutes 30 seconds, long east 170 degrees 10 minutes 58 seconds, or rather nearer the equator than Florence in Italy. It comes down to within 14 miles of the sea, to an altitude of only 692 feet above sea level. It is about half a mile broad, and showed an upper layer of white ice pushing its way over a lower layer which carried dirt and stones. There are 5 isolated roches moutonnées standing at intervals across the valley at the terminal face. On the right-hand side is the Sentinel Rock, 236 feet high, the largest. A few feet to the left comes the Muller Rock, 60 feet high. The Strontian Rock lies nearly 3 chains further to the left, and is about 160 feet high. And lastly, the Barren Rock, 50 feet in height, lies near the river, which flowed out on the extreme left or east side of the glacier. Behind the Sentinel Rock, with the ice still pressing against it, is a rock, since named the Harper Rock, about 170 feet in height, with some moraine debris on its summit, which must have been deposited within the last few years, as no moss or vegetation was to be seen there. Some 8 chains to the left, and still surrounded by ice, the Park Rock, 190 feet, lies behind the Strontian, and is raked by a running fusillade of falling ice from the towering pinnacles behind. For the purpose of understanding this interesting array of rocks across the valley, reference can be made to the sketch plan of the terminal face of Franz Josef Glacier given in Chapter 11. The best point from which to get a general idea of the valley and glacier is the Sentinel Rock, and thither I went as soon as possible to form a plan of attack. The glacier being in such warm latitude and low altitude, and having such a rapid descent, is naturally very much broken and crevassed. From the Sentinel the great icefall can be seen at a distance of 2 3/4 miles, descending in a little over a mile, 1,800 feet. Even from such a distance it presents a grand appearance. Below it, the glacier sweeps round a slight bend, and comes straight down in gigantic waves to the terminal face. There are evidently rocks of the same kind as those exposed at the snout under the ice for some way up the valley, as the glacier has the appearance of heaving or lurching from side to side on its way down between high rocky walls which rise out of the ice. The idea conveyed to my mind was that of water forced at an angle into a narrow rocky channel, and forming waves which rebounded from one side to the other obliquely across the course of the stream. The extent and height of these waves may be seen from some measurements taken just above Cape Defiance, assuming the south bank to be 0. The heights taken every 160 yards across the glacier were as follows: 0, 21, 80, 40, 95, 55, 177, 229, and 205 feet. The glacier flows from south to north, and after leaving the neve and coming down over the steep slope which forms the ice fall, it enters a narrow rock-bound valley of a little over half a mile in width. On the eastern or left-hand side, looking up, the rock slopes back for some 200 to 300 feet and then disappears into luxuriant timber, which clothes the hills up to the usual limit. This rocky bank is cut here and there into deep gorges and bluffs by streams from the hills. On the western side the range rises abruptly out of the ice, for the first 300 to 500 feet, a bare, ice-worn precipice fringed with scrub and bush growing on almost precipitous hillsides for some thousands of feet above. Here and there fine waterfalls drop over the cliffs into the ice. The surface of the glacier, contrary to the general rule with New Zealand glaciers, is practically clear of debris, with exception of a narrow strip along the western side coming from a patch of rocks near the head of the ice fall. This accumulates in the bend above Cape Defiance, a promontory of rock which obstructs the flow of ice on the western side about 2 miles up the glacier, and continues until it joins a larger piece of surface moraine about half a mile from the terminal face, evidently caused by a slip a year or 2 previous. The debris left by the slip will no doubt have fallen over the terminal face and entirely disappeared by the end of 1898. The very broken nature of the glacier is the real cause of its cleanliness and freedom from surface moraine, as the debris falls into crevasses and comes out at the terminal face in the lower layer of dirty ice. From the general appearance of the valley, it was evident that the best plan would be to cross the river and get on to the eastern bank, for the ice looked too rough for a practical route, and the western side was too precipitous to attempt. Accordingly, on November the 4th, after some heavy rain, I went across to the outlet and endeavoured without success to pass over the river on the glacier, while Douglas went down to Nesbitt's hut to bring up the remainder of our stores, which had been left there owing to a flood in the river. I found that the ice was very soft and broken all along the side, and that it was unsafe to attempt a landing on the bank near the terminal face. In fact, it was a decidedly difficult business to get up the sheer ice face onto the glacier. The only course left open to us was to try and force a way straight up the glacier. On the 7th we managed, after some gymnastic feats, to reach a point about 1 mile up the glacier on the western side, but the last 120 yards having taken an hour amongst very bad seracs, we gave up the attempt and returned to camp. The following morning was spent in again trying to get over the river on the ice to the eastern bank, without success, and in the afternoon we went onto the glacier behind the Sentinel Rock, which appeared, from subsequent examination, to be the only possible route to reach the more level ice in the centre. From this point we made our way up and across the glacier by slow degrees, crawling between crevasses and cutting steps up and down high and almost perpendicular hummocks, and after 3 hours were able to step ashore on the eastern bank, about a mile from the terminal. For 200 or 300 feet above the ice, the hillside is bare, ice-worn rock, sloping back at an angle of 25 degrees, and along this we went for a short distance until a deep gorge stopped us. As it was late, we decided to return to camp and move it up to a suitable place on this bank, at the same time bringing up a spare rope to fix at the gorge. We always take a dog with us to catch kiwis, etc. for food, but as our work for some weeks would be on the ice, it was necessary to dispense with the dog's company. When I joined Douglas, I found he had an old friend, Betsy, a black, purebred mongrel, as he called her, and up to this point she had been a faithful, though somewhat useless, companion. Accordingly, while Douglas took her down to the beach for an old digger friend to look after her for a time, I went off to the small farm on the Totara River, obtained half a sheep, and returned to the hospital to sleep. Before returning to camp on the following day, I had a bathe in the hot springs. On nearly every river on the west coast, there are mineral hot springs. Their heat is not due in any way to volcanic agency, and though I have tried to obtain an analysis of the water, some accident has always happened, and I have failed to get particulars. It is generally the case that a mile or so before the river emerges from the hills, a mineral spring is to be found in the bed of the stream, in which case the water will be hot. Sometimes, however, the spring is a few feet above the river level and only warm. The two best I know are those on the Waiho, a mile and a half below the Glacier, and on the Fox River, a mile from the Fox Glacier. In each case they are situated in the riverbed, covered at flood time, and often, after the river has resumed its normal level, they are completely buried in gravel. On the flat near the hospital, hot water can be found almost anywhere. At the depth of 6 feet, it would be warm, at 8 feet below the surface, or on the edge of the riverbed the temperature is 120 degrees, and at 10 feet, or 2 feet below the riverbed, the temperature is 132 degrees, the hottest I obtained. Their rise and fall correspond with that of the river, showing great activity when the latter is high. In order to have a good bathe, the plan was to take a long-handled shovel, scoop out a hollow, and letting it fill in with water, lie down in it and stew. If, however, the bath proves uncomfortably hot, it is easy to let in a little ice water from the river a yard or two away, or even catch a piece of floating ice and place it in the pool. It was a new and pleasing sensation to lie in a hot spring under the shade of tree ferns and enjoy the glorious view of a glacier within a mile and a half, ploughing its way down between steep hills clothed in luxuriant forest and backed by high snow and ice-clad peaks. When going up a river, there is no difficulty in locating these springs, for their smell is strong and rather objectionable. Douglas said that, quote, "You smell as if you've been having tea with the evil one inside an old gasometer," end quote, after having a bathe in one of them. I cannot vouch for the correctness of the comparison, as I have never had tea under such conditions, but can quite imagine the combination would produce much the same effect. On Douglas's return, we moved camp and some 3 weeks' provisions across the glacier and along the eastern side to a point about a mile and a half up the valley, and ascending 400 feet up the ice-worn rocks, found a capital camping place amongst great rata trees and alongside a clear stream of water which ran in a deep, water-worn channel down to the glacier, with many small pools in which to bathe. Situated as we were at Camp 2, in fine rata bush, with a luxuriant undergrowth of tree ferns and other plants, which in England would be called semi-tropical vegetation, it was difficult to believe that we were a mile and a half up and 300 feet above a glacier. Through an opening in the trees in front of our batwing, lofty snow-capped peaks could be seen a mile away across the valley, rising in precipices from steep slopes clothed with dark green bush, while below a pure white glacier flowed at our feet, presenting as fine an instance of crevassed and broken ice as could be wished. A near view of alpine peaks, with a foreground of trees, is of course met with in many places, but it is doubtful whether the beautiful combination of tree ferns, semi-tropical vegetation, glacier and snow-clad mountains can be seen anywhere else except on the Fox Glacier. From the rocky platform at the edge of the bush, a few yards from the camp, we overlooked the glacier flowing past in great broken waves, down to the terminal face, beyond which were glimpses of the river as it wound in and out of the old moraine hillocks, covered with luxuriant timber, to the large river flats below. And 14 miles away, the blue sea was plainly visible, with the white horses raised by a squall of wind. One result of the neighbourhood of the ice is that alpine plants such as the nai-nai, broom, daisies, and edelweiss are found growing amongst the vegetation of the low country. I found one plant of the last named growing within 800 feet of sea level on the Sentinel Rock. It does not appear to grow more luxuriantly at so low an altitude, but on the whole is rather stunted. Finding the ice at the side of the glacier very rotten, we attempted to continue along the side, and succeeded in reaching a rocky cape, which rose about a half mile further up the valley. On ascending the point, we discovered that the rock side had lost its gentle slope, and rose out of the ice in a perpendicular face of several hundred feet, smooth and ice-worn. There was no route along here, so we returned, looking out for a place where we could cross the rough side ice and reach the more level surface in the centre of the glacier. The whole of the 16th was spent in trying to find a route onto the glacier. At 70 or 80 yards from the side, broad crevasses ran across and along the line of flow. Consequently, though the surface was fairly level, it was cut up into huge seracs and hummocks. After 5 unsuccessful attempts, we found a fairly good route, which, however, necessitated some peculiar acrobatic performances. Twice or thrice I had to let Douglas down bodily into a crevasse, so that he could cut steps up to me, the side being too perpendicular to allow us to cut downwards in comfort, and then I had to cut steps up again on the other side for perhaps 40 feet, using the axe with only one hand and holding onto the ice with the other. No doubt, had the glacier been at a higher altitude, there would have been no difficulty in finding several routes, but here the ice was terribly rotten. Occasionally we would hear a report like a pistol shot, or louder, and feel a tremble under our feet, or see a large serac fall down, which looked strong enough to stand for days. Under these circumstances, therefore, we had to be most careful to choose a good line, because it had been decided to move camp again to Cape Defiance, a mile or so further up, on the opposite side, in order to have a good point from which to attack the great icefall and do our work on the neve. If weather came on and delayed us in the upper camp for a week, it would be possible that our retreat to Camp 2 would be cut off by reason of the frequent changes in the surface ice. Having spent some days in survey work and wet weather, on the 22nd we each took 40-pound loads, including camera and instruments, and made for Cape Defiance, 2,864 feet. It occupied just an hour and a quarter to go some 200 yards before we reached the good travelling in the centre. When fossicking for this route the week previous, our gymnastic feats were most interesting and amusing, as we had only a camera to carry. But now, with our loads, we found it not only trying, but most difficult. The swags had to be lowered and pulled up again frequently, receiving very rough handling, regardless of their contents. The centre of the glacier was fairly good going for a short distance, and then we got amongst some bad crevasses again, with long narrow ridges between. Often after crawling along several of these razorbacks, we would find our way blocked by a break in the ridge, and be compelled to retrace our steps and try another line. Luckily, anticipating some such work as this, I had brought a bundle of leafy twigs of rata to stick into the ice and mark our route, to save time on the return, because had we taken the wrong razorback at the start, we might have had an hour's work for nothing. Consequently, when we emerged from the rough ice close under Cape Defiance, there was a trail of rata twigs behind, which would ensure more speedy travel in the future. At Cape Defiance we found the only real piece of lateral moraine on the glacier, about 18 chains long. This cape, or point, is formed by a spur which projects across the flow of the glacier, and, narrowing the valley by 1/4 of a mile, causes the ice to back up behind it to a considerable height. On the upper side of the spur, the lateral moraine lies at right angles to the general flow of the glacier, the ice having swept down into the bed, and then, turning in an eddy, flowed along and around the cape. In the valley formed by the moraine and hillside, we built a level floor of large stones on which to place our batwing. Heavy rain had set in at noon, so we were fairly wet through and uncomfortable by the time we had pitched the camp. Behind us, the hillside had dense alpine scrub on it, and rose very steeply to the rocky pinnacles of Mount Moltke. To the right, a stream, Harper's Creek, it has since been named, came down from the ice fields of the same peak. The valley down which this creek flows is very steep, and on the upper side has sheer rocky precipices, which are 2,000 feet high near the glacier, and as the valley rises they gradually become lower, until at the head they are only some 500 feet. Over this rock wall a waterfall, the Unser Fritz, descends in one leap 1,209 feet, being the drainage of the Andermatten and Baumann glaciers on Mount Rhön. In front of us was the grand ice fall in all its glory, 1,800 feet or more in height, and a mile wide, presenting a dazzling array of towering seracs and deep blue crevasses. I have seen many fine ice falls in Switzerland and New Zealand, but very much doubt if any, except perhaps the Haast Glacier on the Tasman, is as grand as that of the Franz Josef. Though I call it 1,800 feet in height, it may be said that for 3,000 feet at the least, the glacier is really an ice fall. On the 24th, we made an attempt to force a way to the neve. After 3 hours, we reached the head of the ice fall by means of a fairly smooth strip of ice, caused by the inflow of the Almar Glacier on the left. It is generally the rule that where two glaciers join, the crevasses and seracs are much smaller than elsewhere. But after passing the junction, nothing could be done. The neve snow was within a quarter of a mile, smooth and white, but between us was a field of ice broken into seracs and crevasses in a manner which it is impossible to conceive without seeing. Douglas said it looked like a bird's-eye view of an eastern town with a deep blue street between each and every house. The seracs were all square and flat-topped, but surrounded by apparently bottomless crevasses. I could see that the only way to make a successful traverse up this glacier was in the early spring, when the winter snow would form bridges over this impassable piece of ice. It would only be waste of time to attempt to go any further, because nothing could be done without a ladder of at least 25 feet. It was also raining heavily, so we returned to camp and spent the afternoon in making sundry observations, etc. On the following morning we went up the spur behind the camp to 5,000 feet or so, in order to get some compass shots into the upper basin of the neve. From this point the outlook was splendid. Immediately on the right, across Harper's Creek, within a few chains, was the great Unser Fritz waterfall, with its 2 small glaciers and enormous precipices on each side. To the southeast we got a clear view for a short time into the main neve coming off Mount de la Beche, and the saddles leading into the Tasman Glacier. Opposite us we saw the Almar Glacier, a fine open ice field coming off Stirling Rock, behind which Drummond's Peak showed a peculiar array of tooth-like rocks rising out of the field of snow. On the other side of this range lies the Callery River, which joins the Waiho by the hospital. Over the low country to the north, the view was good, but limited. The glacier to the terminal face lay 2,000 feet below, at the foot of great precipices, over which a grand series of waterfalls fell with a roar into the ice. Beyond it lay Lake Maporika, and the sea-coast was easily visible to the Wataroa Bluff. The clouds, however, soon hid everything, and more heavy rain compelled our descent to camp. Next morning, in still bad weather, we retired down the glacier to Camp 2, having decided that no route lay up the ice to the neve. The ice on the line of route had altered very much, even during the last 3 or 4 days, and had it not been for my rata twigs left on the way up, we should have had hard work to find a way. Sometimes we would see a piece of rata 30 feet away and take a quarter of an hour to work round to it. The ice at the place where we had to leave the glacier was even more altered than elsewhere, and it was difficult to recognize the way which we had followed when getting on from the rocks. However, by lowering Douglas to cut steps once or twice, we were able to come off safely and reach Camp 2 at 4 p.m., pretty wet and hungry. We now decided to try a high-level route along the top of the range, behind the camp, onto the Almar neve, and across it, over a shoulder of Stirling Rock, to the main neve. This would involve a considerable amount of track-cutting or blazing in the dense bush and scrub, and probably, with the bad weather we were having, would take some time. I therefore went to Camp 1 at the terminal face, and Douglas went on to the township at Maporika for more stores. Unfortunately, while there, he had a bad attack of influenza, lasting nearly 3 weeks, and so, beyond perfecting the survey and taking some observations of glacier motion, little could be done for the present. In naming the tributary glaciers and peaks which had not already received names from the low country trigonometrical stations, we used those of Swiss guides in Almer, Croz, Baumann glaciers, etc. It is often hard to find names, so we use those of one class for one valley and another class for another locality as far as possible. End of chapter 4.